Other than maybe artisanal pickles, gentrification is probably the thing that best defines today's Brooklyn. And come to think of it, those handmade pickles are just another sign of where we're at. On some level, everyone is affected, particularly artists who need space to create, not to mention sleep. Square footage is a coveted commodity in NYC, so where will people live as they continue to be priced out? And how does this affect the city's broader arts community?
Well, joining us is Charlie Herman. He's the business and culture editor at WNYC Radio, with whom BRIC TV is in partnership on a new series called Making It in NYC. Thanks for joining us,
you bet.
Charlie. And to give us some perspective, some business perspective that is, we want to welcome back Emilio Dorcely, the president and CEO of the Bridge Street Development Corporation in Bed-Stuy. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And before we dive into the discussion, here's just a short sample of a video that we produced recently for the series featuring the Broadway star Sarin Gouja.
I guess in terms of art, making things, playing, that started for me very young. It just came natural. And I had a very, very vibrant imagination, an imaginary world that I cultivated constantly and was supported by my parents.
My name is Sarin Gouja. I'm an artist. I'm based in Brooklyn. My work is primarily theater, film, music. I work as a writer, director, actor, and composition.
So a brief glimpse of Sarin Gouja there on the WNYC BRIC TV partnership on Making It in NYC.
Yeah, Charlie, can you tell us about the concept of the show and how the partnership with BRIC TV came about?
Well, what I've really been interested in is this overlap of artists in New York City and how important art is to the city. I mean, I think it can be a difficult place to live. It's an expensive place to live. And one of the things that makes it so livable and so interesting to be here is just the sheer number of people who are creating things here, who are different types of artists. And so what I wanted to look at was a little bit of this overlap of the issue of how people financially make it in New York, and also them actually creating art, how they actually make it. So Sarin Gouja is a perfect example of this. He is a Tony-nominated performer who is in Fela. He is a performer here throughout town and does a lot of different things to try and make it. But at the same time that he is doing that, there's also that struggle. There's also that need to constantly be looking for the next job, to pay the rent.
Yeah. Right.
You know, and so there are a lot of artists in this town who make it really interesting, who make it desirable to live here. But at the same time, we're facing this affordability crisis for housing, for finding good jobs, for finding the space to actually, you know, make a painting or to do whatever that might be. And as a result, it makes the city really challenging. And what I was really interested in is what happens if the artists leave? What happens if it just becomes too unaffordable? What does it mean for the rest of us who actually want to participate in the arts if it's not here anymore?
Well, Emilio, I look at you as the man who might help bring me back to Bed-Stuy one day, but you're also a developer over at Bridge Street. So how do you guys have a vision for creating neighborhoods that are sustainable for the folks who've been part of Bed-Stuy before the world realized it was great, and the people who want to get in on the experiment as well?
Well, I mean, as was said earlier, we do have an affordability crisis. I think that even before the real estate boom in 2010 and 2011, people were still having some difficulty in finding affordable places to live and affordable places for them to be a first-time home buyer. But now things are even worse. I mean, you have average rents in Bed-Stuy, as an example, for a two-bedroom are somewhere upwards of $3,500 and sometimes even more. The average working person can't afford that. And so, as you know, the mayor has a plan to increase affordable housing, and we're in support of that, but we think much more needs to be done. The reality is that we have a situation, regardless of whether you're an artist or just a working individual or someone who grew up in the neighborhood and went to college and wants to come back and live in the place where you grew up, there's very little opportunity unless you're someone who can afford the $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 in rent. I know we're constantly challenged in trying to find opportunities to create affordable housing. And when people talk about affordable housing, people sometimes just think either either people who make $19,000 or $20,000, but we're really talking about affordable housing for a large spectrum of people. Yeah. We want affordable housing for those who are making $20,000 because they have to live here too. But we also want to make sure that teachers, police officers, firemen, people who are making $60,000, a family who works for the city who wants to raise their family, they also have an opportunity. And so the challenge is, one, finding enough housing, and then two, making sure that you have the right proportions that really give everyone across the whole economic spectrum an opportunity to live in New York.
So Charlie, looking at these artists and people who are trying to make it, they oftentimes are the problem and the solution in some of these neighborhoods. Does that tension ever get expressed or come out during the series?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big problem, which is that they can sometimes be the vanguard. You know, you see artists arrive in a neighborhood, first wave, and you look at neighborhoods in Manhattan, for example, like Soho or Chelsea, which have really become very expensive to live in, obviously. And you're seeing this in Brooklyn and some other communities. So, you know, they're trying to find that right balance. We recently profiled a music venue space where the people who are running it are trying to...
It's Brooklyn border.
Exactly. They're trying to make sure that the center that they're creating there is really connected to the community, that they have community events, that it's not sort of a force of gentrification. But the reality is, in some of these situations is, you know, to what Emilio is saying, sometimes artists are trying to find an affordable space for them to move to as well. They can end up disrupting the neighborhoods that they move to. But there's also a sense that there's a power to gentrification that's, you know, as the city is becoming more expensive, as sort of the center is being pushed out, that it's happening even if artists aren't going to neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy or to East New York. Those areas are already starting to gentrify. Even as the artists are coming at the same time. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg there?
Gotcha.
How do you define the creative economy?
I think the creative economy can really be, it's very broad. It can be everything from the painters and the sculptors and the actors who live in an area, but it can also be a lot of the tech community as well. It can be a lot of media companies. It's pretty broadly defined, and there's a lot of theories, in particular from Richard Florida, who's an economist who has sort of a sociologist looking at how creative economies are really make cities dynamic. But it can also have this effect of raising prices, of making places less affordable, even as it makes them more interesting and more dynamic. So it's a big part of New York City, obviously. When you look at the number of people who are working in a creative economy, it's actually greater than the financial sector, even though the financial sector is bringing in a lot more money to the city. But it is a vibrant, you know, huge part of New York City.
Emilio, I'm curious where you see this ending up in 10 and 20 years. I mean, it's going to be impossible for some artists to live in Brooklyn the way things are going, right? I mean, you have a Broadway star featured in that video who can barely make rent, you know? I mean, how is this going to end up for Brooklyn?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the challenges, when you mentioned Richard Florida, one of the things that he created, the whole theory around the creative economy, was to look at urban areas that were not getting sufficient investment. And the idea was to attract artists with the idea that artists are creative people, and then they would be able to bring creative energy to a particular urban area, open new businesses, do creative things that would then attract people back to the urban center.
We don't need that here.
Well, herein lies the problem. The question is, as we've been doing this, and this is happening all across the country, what types of safeguards were put in place to say that in return for these tax breaks, were we protecting affordability to make sure that as the urban areas began to really improve, that they didn't get to a point where it became unaffordable for the average person. Now, when you take a look at Brooklyn, and Brooklyn has a long history of having a creative economy. People remember in the 80s and the 90s, Fort Greene was where Denzel Washington, Wesley Snipes, Rosie, all these people who we recognize as stars today, when they were early on in their careers, they needed a place to live. I mean, Spike had his spot right a couple blocks from here. And so the idea is that artists choose places that are affordable because as they work on their craft, they want to be in a place where they can afford as they're building their careers, but also they want to make sure they have access to venues. That's why neighborhoods like Williamsburg and Bushwick were also attractive, because of the types of spaces that were available. But when you have a conflict between low income and working class folks all struggling and fighting for the same few affordable spots, artists are sometimes left out the loop. I don't want us to get in a situation where we have to choose.
Working class and low income as well. They're not a lot of trust fund kids with silver spoons. A lot of them are coming up the same way that hard times that the people in the community are being displaced are, right?
Well, what I wanted to add really quick to what you're saying is that when we talk about affordability, we should also look at it from the other side, which it's not just the artist being able to afford living in New York City, but there's also how do we, maybe if we're not an artist, how do we afford going to a museum? How do museums or performing arts institutions make sure that they are affordable and accessible
And culturally competent to those people.
And that speak to those people, that people feel welcome there as well too, because it's not just about making sure that artists can afford to keep creating their works here, which makes the city dynamic and interesting and sort of challenges us.
But who's the art for?
But who's the art for, and who can afford to go to it? And so there's both sides of it. As even as areas gentrify or become more well-off, you want to make sure, and I think a lot of institutions, especially here in Brooklyn, are trying to do that, to be open to different communities.
Well, we're happy for our institutions, particularly those like Bridge Street Development. You can check them out online and get some concrete steps towards home ownership so you can get out of that cycle. And we're also thankful to WNYC for that partnership. You can hear more stories about making it on their air as well as on our YouTube channel. So thanks for being here, gentlemen.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.